Hi, everyone. Thank you for stopping by. I am Sandra Brown. I am the current president of the Association for MPD and Psychopathy Survivor Treatment, Research, and Education. And I'm also the director at the Institute for Relational Harm Reduction and Public Pathology Education. So I am reaching out to therapists today, and maybe you are one of the therapists who don't believe in the outrageous claims of narcissistic abuse. And I'd like to take 5 minutes of your time and talk a little bit about that and bring some clarity and some clarification around that. I'm a psychotherapist that has worked in the field for about 30 years in both psychopathology and also trauma. I began right out of grad school working in the field of psychopathology with personality disorder clinic, with personality disorder clients in a personality disorder clinic that I began. And over the course of that time, they began to bring in their partners because what is notorious with personality disorders is the problems that they have in interpersonal relationships. And so over a course of time, they began, to talk about their relationship problems and bring their partners in. And that's when I began working with the partners and eventually stopped working with PD clients and only worked with survivor partners. And that was a few decades ago. You'll see the books behind me. The book on that end is How to Spot a Dangerous Man Before You Get Involved that I wrote in 2005. And one of the 8 dangerous man types was related to what is called the emotional predator. And it was a discussion about pathological relationships in which one of the partner has personality pathology. In that segment, I was focusing more on the personality pathology related to psychopathy and narcissism. And then a couple years later, the book that's in the center with the mask, that's the 3rd edition, but the 1st edition book had a different cover, and that book is Women Who Love Psychopaths: Inside the Relationships of Inevitable Harm with Psychopaths, Sociopaths, and Narcissists. And it was a seminal book, jumping off the point in the Dangerous Man book about pathological relationships. So the Dangerous Man book was in 2005, and then the Psychopath book, I think, was 2007. And those were considered seminal concepts about these relationships that I named pathological love relationships. And since that time, 30 years ago, and then beginning to publish about the work that I and our agency have been doing over the last few decades, it is a little shocking to me to see what has happened to the theory, the science, and the work of these books and what has happened to this field. And so let's start off by knowing that the real name, the clinical name of this field is traumatic pathological love relationships. It is not narcissistic abuse. And unfortunately, what has happened has been survivor bloggers who have sort of flocked to this genre and began writing their concepts about this. And if you have been out there reading at all, you have probably seen some of these ridiculous concepts about flying monkeys and gray and yellow rocks and Hoover vacuums. You may have heard them talk about narcissists being psychotic and delusional. You may have read the generalizations that all jerks are narcissistic, and them applying symptoms that are not related to narcissism to suggesting that those symptoms are narcissism. And so this has been more than unfortunate. And the whole reason I am making this video today is because we know that as this genre of counseling is gathering steam, that there are a lot of therapists, and we have gotten some feedback about that just shake their head and they're not buying any of it. And so I wanted to acknowledge that and wanted to talk and give you some more information about the real science of this field, not what you have read through bloggers. So you might be surprised to find out that there are over 50,000 logged agency hours in treatment. A couple of decades of raw data collection on the relationships and the survivor trauma. There is a relational dynamics theory, a trauma survey, an atypical trauma study, collegiate research with Purdue University on the survivor's profile, and the likely reasons of targeting, an evidence-based, trauma-informed model of care treatment approach, and coming soon, a certification program. So unfortunately, there are survivors, who believe that a personal experience is all the education they need, and they have tried to explain this field and these relationships outside of any real training or any real science. And it began when they started off with the wrong word and calling it narcissistic abuse. The actual name, as I mentioned before, is traumatic pathological love relationships, which actually encompasses what we call the danger zone of personalities. And that concept of there are dangerous personality types that we should be focused on, especially within, the victimization field, was not just created out of nowhere. It has its basis right out of the DSM, out of the alternative model of personality disorders. It's based on research in dangerousness and recidivism, and it is also related to psychopathology studies and assessment tools. And that's where the concept of pathological relationships was taken from. It was just taken from the information from the DSM, from the dangerousness research, and psychopathology research. So PLRs are a look at the higher end of a spectrum of disorders that include narcissism, antisocial personality disorder, and psychopathy variants of sadism and Machiavellianism, not merely narcissism, which untrained bloggers have hyper focused on. And so you are right. The numbers of frequency does not work when you focus only on narcissism. And as we know, NPD is rarely a standalone disorder anyway. So here are the real numbers. They were generated not from narcissism only. Again, because the field is called pathological relationships, not narcissistic abuse. It is a view of the danger zone personality. So the numbers were generated by taking the frequency rate for some of the cluster B disorders, narcissism and antisocial, and also from taking the frequency rate for psychopathy, according to the world's leading expert on psychopathy, Dr. Robert Hare. It was then divided by the US population, and then it was multiplied by 5. And 5 is a number that reflects how many people have been harmed by the person's psychopathology. And that's actually an average, because with psychopaths, the number is usually higher than 5, but we tempered it a little bit just to keep the number moderate. So when you do all that math, that number is close to 100 million people and reflects, again, the upper spectrum of the danger zone disorder impact, not narcissism only. And again, bloggers got it wrong. So as you probably know, NPD is part of a cluster of disorders and also a slew of comorbidity factors rarely focused on by survivors who aren't trained in psychopathology, personality science, or trauma, the needed knowledge and training bases to truly understand why pathological relationships and a survivor's trauma have worked its way into the traumatic stress studies grouping. The fact it is arriving there in the traumatic stress studies field indicates that there is more science to this than bloggers inaccurately describe to others. Instead, you hear those ridiculous things I mentioned before about monkeys and rocks and vacuum cleaners. And sure, no traumatic mind would accept, or therapeutic mind would accept those. Anybody with a therapeutic training would not accept that, and nor should you. And it doesn't even sort of rate at the pop psychology level, more or less the science level. And so, yes, bloggers have made it seem like every bad relationship is narcissistic abuse, and they quote partner behaviors that are not associated with NPD or any other danger zone personality, really. And yes, they have hacked the real understanding of disorders falling into the psychopathology field, not merely dysfunctional relationships, the way they make pathological relationships seem. We are really the real understanding of this lies in psychopathology. So then they, have taken these concepts, these monkeys and rocks and hoovers, and call themselves experts and offer non-trauma informed care as coaching services and pass on these concepts about flying monkeys to the next survivor who then picks up that lingo and that concept, and it just continues to grow and grow. And so, that's how it began, the overtaking of real science. And it is aggravating, and more importantly, it is unethical. So just think what it would have been, what might have happened if before the real theory and science behind what is now a formidable form of treatment, let's say DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy, was first hijacked by survivors who took it, fast and hard to the internet, putting their spin on it. And poor Dr. Marcia Linehan's legitimate form of theory and treatment may have been dissed altogether, and our field would be the poorer because of it, because of not having that formidable form of treatment and theory. So welcome to what has happened to the traumatic, pathological, love relationship field. A group of therapists mortified by what has happened to the scientific information associated with real traumatic pathological relationships by bloggers created a professional clinical association for the training of mental health professionals to reclaim and reiterate the real science, lest we all believe the bloggers. And you can find out more information about this clinical association with the real science at survivortreatment.com. So we have made headway. PESI is a very large continuing education provider, and our association have begun our model of care training to therapists and to unveil all the science that really does exist in this genre of counseling. And we have trained close to 1,000 therapists within a few months of 2021. And so while that's good news, it would be better news if therapists were coming to understand this genre of counseling from informed and educated people and not being turned off by the blogger narcissism experts. That's our hope in the training, through PESI and through the association, is to help unveil the real science behind this. On the other hand, blogger numbers are growing by the day, and more of these non-trauma informed care sites are popping up, and that's why you hear more and more about flying monkeys and ridiculous things. And so while part of me appreciates survivors wanting to do something in the absence of enough trained therapists, we can see the problems that well-meaning intentions have caused, and in many unfortunate ways, they have become this field's flying monkeys. In spite of this obstacle of having to correct inaccurate, non-trauma informed care, um, ridiculousness, we are here to introduce you to or remind you of the real science for a real emerging genre in this traumatic stress studies field that claims collegiate research, 50,000 logged agency hours, relational dynamics theory, outcomes of trauma surveys, an atypical trauma study, an evidence-based, trauma-informed model of care treatment approach, and coming soon, a certification program. So as a clinical mind, we invite you to review the real science to determine for yourself its merits. Bloggerology has brought largely untreated, sometimes traumatized survivors into the forefront without the clinical education to adequately explain the now 3 decades old traumatic stress genre of pathological relationships. And so we hope you will take a deeper look from the psychological science end of it at our website at survivortreatment.com. And we are, of course, here to answer any clinical questions you might have about it. On the Survivor Treatment website is also information about the training, including the kinds of science that are covered in that clinical training. And we are coming up with the next part of the training, which will be the treatment portion if you have interest in becoming trained in this end of the traumatic stress studies field. So thank you for taking a few moments to learn about that there's more to this genre of counseling than what has been represented out there. And we would love for you to become involved or learn more about it at survivortreatment.com, or you can reach us at survivortreatment@gmail.com. Thank you for joining me today. This has been Sandra Brown. Bye-bye.